What does it say? The Lord said to Abram. The Lord said to Abram. That's a wonderful verse. And it's wonderful because it shows that our God is a God of unconditional and missionary grace. I don't know if you've ever were at Sunday school as a child and you heard the stories about Abram and Abraham. I remember when I was at seminary, I had this Australian Bible teacher. Her specialism was the Old Testament. And she said that when she was at Sunday school, it would always be, there once was a good man named Abraham. And then God comes along and sees that he's a good man and says, well, I'll choose you to work through. But actually, if you look at Abraham's life here, he's a pagan. He doesn't know God at all. See, but God's grace seeks out the undeserving. It seeks out people in far-flung places that don't know him, and he calls them to trust in him, and he calls them to follow him with absolutely no prior knowledge of him whatsoever. See, geography, culture, and religion are absolutely no barriers to the unconditional grace and call of God. And even when all human hope is extinguished, even when it seems like nothing is going to go well and nothing is going to go right, God chooses to speak. And he chooses to have his grace shine anew. Listen, if you went back to Genesis chapter 1, to the creation, you would find God speaking. God speaks his creation into being. And here in Genesis chapter 12, at arguably the beginning of redemption, what do you find? God speaking. That is telling you that God is the kind of God who, when he calls people, brings something out of nothing, brings life out of death, brings hope out of failure. I mean, it's just all over this passage. And this is reinforced actually by the promise of blessing that God makes to Abraham in verses 1 to 3. The phrase, I will, occurs in some form in verses 1 to 3 7 times. Now, if you know anything about numbers in the Bible, the number 7 symbolizes perfection. What that text is saying to us is that God is making a perfect promise to this undeserving man, Abram. God just comes to him and says, I'm going to bless you. There's nothing prior to that would suggest that he would have blessed Abram. God just chooses to do it. So what is this saying? Let me try and bottom line this. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. You have to know that if you're going to be a Christian. Now, you might think that actually there are sort of these religious types. Oh, that person is the kind of type to become a Christian. You know, they're a moral person, they're a good person, they're a kind person. That's the kind of person to become a Christian. Friends, there is no religious type. The thing that comes first is the call of God. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what family you're from. It doesn't matter what culture or language that you're from. It doesn't even matter initially what religion you're following. The call of God comes to you and calls you out of that to follow him. God's call is universal. It's unconditional. It's open to everyone. Christianity stands on that fact, or it doesn't stand at all. It is unconditional. But look at Abram's response to this. Verse 4. What does Abram do? Well, God, I have some questions. No. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. See, even though the call of God comes unconditionally, it must be received unconditionally. And it also actually must be received personally. You can't trade on somebody else's faith or somebody else's understanding of the call of God on your life. It has to be a personal response because the call itself will radically and profoundly change you. Because I want you to notice something here. Notice God doesn't tell Abram really where he's going. He just says, I'll show you. You're just going to have to wait and see. You know, wander around and I'll show you where you're going. Abram doesn't ask actually, so where exactly am I going? Are there going to be any service stations along the way? What's going to happen to me? How will I know I'll be safe? When am I going to know this journey is going to be over? That's telling you something. It tells you that when you put conditions on following God, you lose the call. We can't actually put any conditions on it. If anyone says, well, I'll become a Christian if I get such and such a benefit. Okay, God, I know you're calling me to put my trust in you and to follow you or to even become a Christian in the first place, but I'm going to have to know that there are certain things in place that means that I know I can trust you. Maybe if you give me that relationship that I really want, or that job that I've really been longing for, or that place that I really want to live. Maybe if you give me these things, Lord, then maybe I'll follow you. But the problem is when you do that, it shows that you haven't really responded to the call. When the God of the universe comes to you and calls you to follow him, it's not a negotiation. You don't bargain, you obey. And I know that might sound severe, but it's not. Because what has God done before Abram even leaves? He promises to bless him. He says, I will bless you. Like, this call might seem strange. It might seem like you're taking a lot of risks, Abram. But I will bless you, and you're going to have to trust me. That's actually given to all of us. That promise of blessing as we follow God along the way. I think actually a lot of us are treating the Christian life like an adventure and not a quest. Do you know the difference between those two things? As a child, I remember reading the stories of King Arthur. My grandfather used to read them to me. And there were always these knights going out on quests and having these amazing adventures. But I didn't actually understand what the difference was. Because it's very easy for us to think of the call of God and the call to be a Christian like an adventure rather than a quest. In an adventure, you go off and you basically come back relatively the same. Maybe with some riches or with some experiences that you've had. You've gone out and you've come back and you're basically the same. But a quest is very different. A quest changes you. If you even come back at all, you will not be the same person when you return. Many of you will have had experiences of that in your own lives. See, Christianity is not a negotiation. It is not an adventure, although there are many adventurous things happening along the way. Christianity is a quest, and it must be gone upon unconditionally. I hope you'll forgive me another Lord of the Rings reference. I'm sure there's a bingo card out there somewhere when I'm preaching sermons that people say, here's another Lord of the Rings reference. Well, here's the thing. If you've ever read The Hobbit, the first book in that series, The Hobbit is an adventure. Bilbo goes out and he comes back and he's very rich. But The Lord of the Rings is a quest. None of the people that take the quest to go and destroy the ring come back the same. They're all wounded or changed in some way, shape, or form. And I want you to be clear, if you're even considering being a Christian here this morning and answering the call of God, you will not be the same. You will come back different. But you will be blessed. That is the promise. And listen, it doesn't matter if you grew up in a Christian household or not. Eventually, you have to hear and respond to the call of God personally. It's kind of obscured here by the English translation, but in verse 1, God literally says to Abram in the Hebrew, you get out. You. It's like he's pointing at Abram and saying, you need to get out and go. This is a personal call. And I grew up in a Christian household. I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful that I was taken to church by my parents and I learned the Bible stories and I learned how to be a Christian in some senses, but it wasn't until I was 16 years old, right? 16 years of hearing those stories, until I responded to God's call to follow him, until I heard it personally. If I hadn't heard that, I would have continued being a nice, respectable, moral little Christian pagan until I responded to his call personally. Listen, it's no good to have the trappings of Christianity. It's no good to have the general beliefs of Christianity if you haven't heard the call personally. Every parent here of children who have become Christians will tell you that faith is never borrowed. It has to be owned. It has to become your own at some point. So have you heard that call? It comes to you unconditionally, but have you responded unconditionally? Have you heard that call? And I hope you can see that this call of God in our lives is as radical as it is unconditional. Let's just think for a moment. What is God calling Abram to do? God is calling Abram to thoroughly leave his comfort zone. He's calling him to go from his home culture, right, where everything was familiar. And by the way, back in Abram's time, traveling was exceptionally dangerous. You could be robbed, you could be murdered. I mean, there are so many things that could happen to you. It's not like you just book a plane ticket and you get on the plane and you're fine on the other end. This was a dangerous thing to do. He's called to leave his family. He's called to become this nomad pilgrim, a stranger on the earth. In leaving the household of his father, Abram was giving up everything. He was giving up his inheritance. He was giving up all of his property rights and security. When the head of a household died at that time, the oldest son assumed the title of the head of the household. as well as all of the responsibilities and the privileges, like this ancestral land and all this property and wealth. In trusting God and heading into the unknown, Abram is giving all of that up. He's giving up his physical security. He's giving up everything that was familiar to him. He's giving up his financial security. He's leaving familiar lands and familiar people. Some of you know what it's like to do that as a Christian. Abraham is choosing instead to live on the promise of God. So here's the point. Abram can only become a blessing to others if he has the willingness to leave the normal sources of human security. Christianity doesn't work if we stay in our comfort zone. God promises to bless us, but he also says to Abram, I will bless everyone else through you. But if I'm going to bless everyone else through you, you're going to have to leave your comfort zone, and you're going to have to do some things that are pretty scary and pretty difficult. Abram has to narrow his options to one singular horizon if he's going to be a blessing, if he's going to lead a life of purpose. And this call of Abraham, by the way, is the same one that every single follower of Jesus has had since Jesus came to earth, died, and rose again. Think about it this way. All right, every Christian has been called to leave everything behind and follow Jesus to a land that they have not seen, called heaven, but that God has promised will be better than the present land that we're in. That's the character of the call. And every Christian has heard that. Listen, I know this first point in the sermon has been very long, but this is the groundwork that we need to hear if we're going to understand everything that comes after this. Because even though this call is unconditional, and even though it's radical, and it calls for real risk, let's be honest, the challenge for anyone hearing this call is that it's scary. It's a fearful thing. So let's turn to look at that now. Because I love how the Bible is just incredibly realistic. Because it doesn't take long, does it, for Abraham to falter in his trust of God's promises. This is actually an incredibly human portrait of him here in the Bible. I want you to know, if you're not familiar with the Bible and you think that it's just a list of heroic people who never got anything wrong, put that away. Abram is a real human being. You don't just get like one-dimensional superhumans here. You get real people. Because what does Abram do? He starts the journey, right? He comes north from Ur of the Chaldeans, goes up and then down south through the promised land, through the land of Canaan, the land that would become the land of Israel. But what is he doing as he goes, right? He's building these altars. He's building these places of worship to God as he travels through the land. And there's so much more that I could say about the locations that he chooses to build those altars, but we'd be here forever, so I'm not going to do that right now. Email me, come and talk to me at the end of the service or something. But when he gets to the Negev, by the way, Negev is just the Hebrew word for south, right? So he gets to the south of this territory. What does he do? He doesn't stop. Right? He shoots right down through the bottom of the promised land and goes to Egypt. Well, why does he go to Egypt? Right? He goes to Egypt because there's a famine in the land, which are pretty common back then, by the way. And why would he go to Egypt? Well, think about it. The River Nile and the inundation of the Nile meant that regular flooding meant that food was more reliable. So it makes logical sense, doesn't it, for Abraham to go, well, there's no food here, so I'm just going to go to the place, even though it's not the promised land. I'm going to go there so that I have security and I have a more reliable food supply. Right, but pause there. Abram is already trusting in conventional wisdom. He's already trying to be driven by his own sense of self-preservation. Right? God has promised to provide for him. God has promised to bless him, but Abram is choosing to go his own way. See, all throughout the Bible, God is making pretty outrageous promises to people. I mean, just absolutely sky-high, stellar promises in the face of impossible odds to bless people. And those people are wavering when circumstances seem to threaten that. And a famine certainly seems to threaten that. And you see that here where Abram chooses to get safety in Egypt. We'll see it again, actually, as we go through his life story, where he chooses to lie to protect himself instead of actually tell the truth. Because what does Abram do in Egypt? He's afraid, isn't he? He's afraid for his own life, and he's worried things won't go well for him. So what does he tell his poor wife, Sarai? He tells her to lie for him. He actually puts her at risk to save his own skin. See, Abram's been called out of his comfort zone, hasn't he? We saw that. but he's actually willing to put others at risk to secure his own comfort. His own wife. Poor woman. He decides to pretend that Sarai is his sister because if a powerful man in that day decided to take a woman as his wife, he might choose to negotiate with a brother for a bride price, but he would absolutely kill a husband. Right? Abram is in danger here, but he chooses to trust his own wisdom rather than the promise of God. And here's the irony. It works out pretty well for Abram, doesn't it? What does Abram get as a result? Right? He gets all of these weird things, female donkeys and camels and sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants, right? Lucky Abram. I wouldn't know what to do with all those. Our flat wouldn't fit them. But he gets all of these things. He becomes a rich man. He gets a lot of physical blessings, doesn't he? But it's not because God has blessed him. It's because he's lied. In fact, the lie is so patently obvious that when he's called out by Pharaoh, Abram says nothing. The lie is so obvious that he just leaves. He's just deported from the land of Egypt. So here's the point. Fear that things won't go well for us as we pursue the call of God on our lives lead us to try and secure our own safety when the call seems too risky. And let me be abundantly clear about this. Just because something works out doesn't mean it's right. That's what's being taught to us here. Just because something works out well for us doesn't mean that God has blessed it. Because it very much depends on the means by which we get those things. When we see someone in need, for example, financially, we might hold back in fear. Because we fear risking our own lifestyle. We fear risking our own comfort and our finances to actually help that person. So what are we doing? We're missing out on blessing. The blessing that God would release into our lives. Because the Bible says it's more blessed to give than to receive. And instead of being a person known for being radically and riskily generous, we're actually just known for being close-handed. We'll pray for someone or we'll comfort them verbally, but we won't actually step out to physically and financially help that person. And that's motivated by fear. I'm saying that from personal experience. Or think about it this way. If you're given an opportunity to share that you're a Christian with someone at work or one of your family members that either doesn't know Jesus or maybe particularly hostile to him, that can be a fearful thing. And what we often do is we dodge speaking about our faith because we don't want to risk our comfortable position or social position at work. Right? That is a lie of omission. But we do it because we're afraid. Or think about when we see someone at church who's lonely. Clearly they're lonely. Clearly they're on the margins. We see them coming week by week and we see not many people talking to them. They're sitting alone, but we don't go and reach out to them. We'd rather stay socially comfortable. We'd rather talk to the people that we already know. And anyway, someone else will talk to them. Right? It's someone else's problem. Someone else will take that risk. We do it because we're afraid. Or, like Abram, we lie to cover ourselves when the risk appears. Here's the irony. The irony here is that the lie Abram tells has consequences down the line. You have to take the long view here. Abram's own descendants, Isaac and Jacob, will be torn apart by the lies and the deceptions that they tell. Well, where do you think they learned it? Those lies have consequences down the line. See, God has promised to bless Abram and that all of the nations would be blessed through him. But actually, instead of spreading blessing, this lie that Abram tells twice, because we're going to see it later on, will result in the spreading of a curse. There's danger here. This is what fear leads to. Listen, we need courage. We need courage to answer the call of God on our lives because it involves risks. Right? No quest ever left the people who went on it unchanged. A boat in the harbor is safe, but that is not what a boat is for. A boat is for sailing. Faith is meant to be put into action. A call is meant to be responded to and followed. Right? Think of the risks that God might be calling you to as a follower of his. Think of the fear that comes along with these things. Let me just list a few things. Right? Risk of as a believer, bringing children into a darkening and an unknown world. There is risk involved in that. Some of you have taken that risk, and that is a good thing, but it's a fearful thing. Or the risk of taking on the radical change of marriage and the upheaval of the familiar. That's a risk. Think about the risk, the call to leave home, leave family, leave country, to settle elsewhere, or to serve as a missionary cross-culturally. That is a risk. God might be calling you to that risk. Think about the risk of leaving your comfort zone to make friends with people that you might not immediately connect with. And I'm going to say this thing now because actually as a church, there are risks involved in all of the changes happening here at TCF. We all sense it. We've all experienced it over the last 4 years. More people are coming in from different church backgrounds. There's a greater strain on resources, both human resources and financial resources. There's the need for more staff and increased financial giving. Listen, there's a lot of uncharted territory ahead for us as a church, and there is risk involved in that. But here you see that God is always and constantly calling his people out of their comfort zones into uncharted territory and off the map. And the problem is we default to the map we've been using for the last 40 years, and that's not going to work. Because just like those old maps in the medieval period where there was this big unknown bit and it just said, here be dragons, and there was a picture of a dragon, that's where we are now. So the mission and the call does not change, but the map has to change. And there are risks involved in doing that. And there is no denial of that here in this passage. I know I'm going on and on and on here, and I am so sorry, but let me just say one more thing. There's a risk involved in becoming a Christian. You can talk to some people in this church who have become Christians from a Muslim background. The risk to them was their life. The risk to them was their family. They left everything familiar to come to a place that was unfamiliar because they started to follow Jesus. It may not even be that severe for you. Maybe you're actually from the West and you're thinking of becoming a Christian, but you'll think, well, if I become a Christian, my whole life is going to have to change. I'll have to admit that I've been wrong all these years. I'm going to have to admit that I was actually following a different calling that was destructive to me rather than a calling that was going to actually provide the blessing that God had promised me. That's a risk, and I don't want you to be ignorant of that risk. But we'll see here in the life of Abram that is a risk worth taking. Right, there's a missionary called Jim Elliot who said that he is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And this is the risk. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul, lose his self? If you want to lead a life of purpose, if you want to lead a life of direction, there is risk involved in that. But nothing ventured, nothing gained. So listen, let me ask you, what are the ways that you're clinging to security out of fear? Security is not a bad thing, but we're obsessed with it right now because we have to be honest, the world feels dangerous, doesn't it? It feels unsecure, and that makes us insecure. And we try and bury our heads in the sand, and we try and, huddle in the church, and we turn our backs on the world outside because taking the risk to go out there makes us feel insecure. But here we're being called to a kind of security that we cannot lose. So let me bring you to the final point that this passage is making. Where do you find the courage? I mean, as Christians, we all know what we're being called to. I'm sort of preaching to the choir here in many respects. How do we find the courage? How do we find the courage to raise our children in this world? How do we find the courage to share our faith with others? How do we find the courage to step out and befriend people that we don't really know and understand? How do we find the courage to stretch ourselves financially, even though it's affecting our lifestyle, because we know it's more blessed to give than to receive? Well, let me show you. Because none of this matters without this. Because otherwise I could just end the sermon there and say, you just got to try harder. Rubbish. Because there is a principle here that if you really embrace it, will change your life. Here's where you find the courage to take the kinds of risks that Abram took. Because as Christians, we've already seen, haven't we, that we're called to take similar risks, to go into the unknown, right? To trust an unknown future to a known God. That's what we're called to do. But just listen to the things that Jesus calls his followers to do. Skip to the New Testament, Luke's Gospel. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Yikes. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Can you see how high the bar is? Later on in Luke's Gospel. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. I know I'm making it worse right now, but don't worry, I'm going to make it get better. Right, just go and reread the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. That is all about what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus responding to his call. How do you find the courage to live a life of radical purpose like that? I read a poem this week by a poet called Malcolm Guite. He's a Christian poet, and he puts it this way. How do you live life as if you had no fear of losing? How do you spend as if you had no need to earn? How do you turn your cheek as if it felt no bruising? How do you lend as if you needed no return? Wouldn't that be a beautiful life? If this church and this city was full of people that lived like that, wouldn't it be a beautiful thing? Don't you long to live in a world like that? Don't you long to be that kind of person? But don't you keep getting in your own way? Doesn't your fear and insecurity stop you from trusting? Why do we struggle with that? Well, it's interesting because if you look at the promises made to Abram, there is one promise that actually forms the bedrock of all of these promises, and it's the promise of a son. The only way that Abram is going to spread the blessing of God to the nations is through his family line. And for that, he needs an heir. He needs a son. All of the blessings of God, all of the promises hang upon the promise of Isaac to Abram. So Abram finds the courage to follow and to trust God the same way you and I do, by trusting the promise of his son. You know, the Bible is full of promises made to us. I'm sure if you wrote them down, it would take you a very long time. But there is one place in the New Testament that says this: all the promises of God find their yes in Jesus. That's where they find their yes. See, like Abram, we hang our hope on the promised son, because Jesus himself is the fulfillment of the promise to bless the families of the earth through Abram. Not only that, but even though he is the true son of promise, Jesus is also the true Abram. Think about what Jesus did. Jesus heard the call of God and answered it, didn't he? The call to go into an unknown land, to an unfamiliar people, to be a stranger and a foreigner on the earth, to give up all of his wealth and glory and security. I mean, Abram took a long journey on foot back in that day, but I'll tell you, it's nothing compared to the infinite distance between heaven and earth. You know, Jesus came from heaven to earth, to hell and back again in answer to the call of God, so that the promised blessing might flow to you and I. He left heaven itself and all of its glory in order to die for people like you and me, fearful, vacillating people like you and me, so that our lives might finally have purpose. So what does Philippians chapter 2 say? Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant and being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. We even sang it earlier, didn't we? He left his Father's home above, so free, so infinite his grace, emptied himself of all but love, and bled for Adam's helpless race, 'tis mercy all, immense and unconditional, I would add, and free. Friends, Jesus journeyed further than Abram ever did as well. He traveled the infinite distance from heaven to earth. He traded immortality for mortality. He went from heaven to hell and back to answer God's call to save you. Jesus also lost his security. What does he cry out on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me? That was the last shred of security he had left, and he let go of it so that you and I could have the only security that matters, knowing that our eternal futures are secure. And that is the only way you and I are going to have the courage to answer a call like this. Only then can we risk being a people on mission. Because any call God places on us is minuscule in comparison to what he's already done in us and for us through Jesus. Here's the bottom line, and I'll finish with this. You find that courage to answer the call of God by trusting the Son of Promise who already answered it for you. You trust an unknown future to a known God. So, Christian, will you rededicate yourself to answering his call today? And if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, will you hear his call? Will you accept the risks? And will you follow him? And will you help us to learn how to follow him as well? Let's pray. Lord, we lead saturated, overloaded, and fragmented lives. We're pulled every which way, and we can't seem to find the right direction to travel in. We're frustrated that we're so often diverted, and we long to know the overriding passion of a heart that enables us just to will one thing, to follow you. Help us, Lord, to listen to your voice. Help us to hear the call of the one who was called from heaven to earth for us. When you say, come follow me, may the cry of our hearts be, yes, Lord. For we ask this in your name. Amen. I'm going to hand over to Doug and the band who are going to help close our service together.